The active shooter situation is being treated as a terrorism investigation. It is being led by the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, and we will continue to investigate it as an act of terrorism until the proof shows us otherwise.
Officials today talking about the deadly shooting in Tennessee that left 4 Marines dead. The head of Homeland Security Committee said he thought the attack was inspired by ISIS.
My judgment, in my experience, is that this was an ISIS-inspired attack, and it has been opened as a terrorism investigation by the FBI, which is a very significant event in this case.
Authorities are now investigating the gunman's travel in the Middle East, including one trip to Jordan and a possible visit to Yemen. They say he spent several months in the region. His electronic devices have been sent to the FBI crime lab in Virginia for analysis. And investigators are looking into his past, including a brief career as a mixed martial arts fighter and a stop for drunk driving back in April. Joining me now is Dr. Erroll Southers, a terrorism expert and former FBI agent and author of Homegrown Violent Extremism. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Reverend. Pleasure to be here.
First, what's your reaction to the Homeland Security Chairman saying this attack was inspired by ISIS?
Well, I think it's always challenging when the speculation gets ahead of the facts. As of yesterday's shooting, the only thing that we knew for sure was the fact that we had an individual with an Arabic-sounding last name, perhaps a Muslim, and had attacked several government locations, military locations, and that in and of itself was certainly cause to rise to a suspected act of terrorism because of the pronouncements made by ISIS to attack government locations and because of it being the last day of Ramadan. But again, no specificity to suggest that it was ISIS-inspired at that time, nor any that I know of as of this moment.
Now, there's a lot of discussion on the difference between how this case is being described and how people talked about the massacre in Charleston. I want to play you some sound from the very first press conferences following both tragedies. Listen.
We are conducting this as an act of domestic terrorism.
We will treat this as a terrorism investigation until it can be determined that it was not.
I do believe this was a hate crime. It will be investigated as a hate crime.
So how do officials decide whether they're investigating terrorism or not?
Well, Reverend, you know, terrorism is a term that has typically been used over the years as it related to state-sponsored groups. But in a more contemporary sense, we're using terrorism to define or attach to individuals or non-governmental groups. There are 3 things we really need to think about when we think about terrorism. We need to think about the threat or the use of violence. We need to look at whether the targets of those violent acts are civilians. And then we need to determine whether or not a political objective was met. So in the South Carolina shooting, we had a whole list of items readily available, unfortunately, when that shooting occurred that would suggest it was an act of domestic terrorism. We had a manifesto by the suspect. We had connectivity to websites, supremacist websites. We had statements made to the victims who were in the church at that time, and a pronouncement that he wanted a race war to start. So it would seem to me that individual instance, we had enough to start with a terrorism investigation, perhaps even before Mr. Roof was even apprehended.
So you agree then when former Attorney General Eric Holder talked to the Huffington Post about Charleston. I want to read how we define terror, he said. We have a young man who apparently becomes radicalized as a result of an incident and becomes more radicalized as a result of what he sees on the internet, then goes and does something that by his own words apparently is political/violent act with a different set of circumstances. And if you had dialed in religion there, Islam, that would have been called an act of terror. I mean, you literally wrote the book you did on homegrown violent extremism. Do you see any difference between the Charleston shooter and the Tennessee shooter?
I see no difference at all. In fact, as I mentioned previously, I see more evidence to initiate a terrorism investigation in Charleston, at least as quickly as they did in Chattanooga. Terrorist actions strive for specific ideological goals or objectives, and Dylan Roof had goals and objectives spelled out both physically and verbally when he was in the church that day. So I would think that I would have to agree with former Attorney General Holder that, in fact, a terrorist investigation was warranted in Charleston at the onset.
I had to take note that African Studies Professor William Jelani Cobb, he points out the first anti-terrorism law in U.S. history was the Klan Control Act. So we have a lot to look into here, and I'm sure we will continue the discussion. Dr. Erroll Southers, thank you for your time tonight. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Reverend.